Hello and welcome to our webcast today on employee engagement survey best practices. Today we'll be sharing best practices on how to set up, administer, report, and then roll out your employee engagement results. My name is Charles Rogel, and I'm the Vice President of Products and Marketing here at DecisionWise. I'll be presenting today with Kristen Chapman. Kristen is the Vice President of Client Services at DecisionWise and leads our team of assessment advisors who administer surveys for clients around the world. She's also an expert on how to conduct employee surveys and get the most from the results. And actually, Kristen's been recently promoted as a principal here at DecisionWise, where she leads a team of consultants that works together to service our clients. I want to provide a brief overview of DecisionWise. We have been in business now since 1996. We specialize in conducting employee engagement surveys and then helping our clients use the feedback to promote organization change and improvement. This webcast is scheduled for 60 minutes. Everyone's on mute, so if you have questions, please use the question tool to submit them, and we will try to address those as we go. This webcast has been approved for 1 hour of recertification credit through HRCI and SHRM, and after the presentation, I'll send an email that includes the program codes to redeem the free credit, along with links to the slides and other downloads from today. You can also download the slides and other samples in the handout section on the toolbar on the right. So if you go to the handout section, you'll see the slides that I'm showing, as well as other samples from the presentation. So to begin, we want to talk about this, this idea of outcome levels from an employee survey. And so basically what happens is, as I've been working here at DecisionWise and talked to a lot of people looking to conduct a survey, they usually fall into one of these 4 categories where they're looking to maybe start off and establish a baseline. Some people are looking to maybe do some executive action planning. Others are maybe trying to get the results down to their managers for action planning. And then there's another group that's been doing this for a while or have the resources and capabilities, and they're using the results to kind of drive organization change and development. So, Kristen, I wanted you to kind of talk about some of these different phases and what it means to be transactional as opposed to transformational.
Sure. So if it's the first time that you're conducting an employee survey, then it's most recommended that you focus on, really understanding kind of what is the baseline your employees are saying. What is it that's most important to them? What do they feel? You as HR leaders or managers or the executive team, you may have heard things, and you may have a sense of what you think are going to be people's hot buttons, where the concerns might lie, what's working well for them. But this is a chance to really gather data in a way that sort of validates or challenges some of your assumptions about what's really going on in the organization. And so often we find that people are looking, as a first-time administration, or it's been a number of years, there's been a lot of changes in the organization, that establishing this baseline is a good first step. Our recommendation is that you take it at least one step beyond just getting the data. If you're going to be asking about engagement and measuring it, then you at least should be taking some action based on those results. But again, for a first administration, it's very reasonable to expect that you just do kind of a high-level action planning.
Yeah.
And so, Charles, this might look like, 1 or 2 different priorities that may come out of the results, communicating those results back to the employees and saying, high level, this is what, thank you for participating, this is what we hear, or this is what we've heard from you as far as a couple of top strengths, here's a couple of things that we're going to focus on. And that's where you start to move it just beyond measuring engagement, but to say, we're listening, we're taking action, even if it's just at that high level for the first year.
Okay.
So that's where you move into the transformational. You're not just, listening, you're not just asking people what they think every year. You're saying, we hear you and we're going to take action. What we find if we do that is that you actually have an increase of participation rate. You have people that begin to be more honest and invested in the whole process of engagement. And then once you've established that trust and confidence in employees after your initial administration, then bringing managers in to receiving results, asking them to create action plans at their level is the next nice phase that we find to be beneficial. And then, the benefit of that, of course, is you're putting that control and that ownership to the managers as well. It doesn't mean that you won't have any items or action items at an executive level. That still is typically what happens. There's always going to be some executive level or senior leadership level initiatives company-wide, and then there's going to be some that are very local to the manager's team.
And I think that with manager action planning, that's a big next step, right?
It is a big next step.
You've got to design the process where you can get the results to the managers, and you've got to be able to spend the time to help them do this action planning and actually do something with results.
And that's a really good point. It can feel a little overwhelming. So some organizations come to us and say, we want to do everything right the first year. Mm-hmm. And our advice is, well, hold on, let's start to establish this baseline, show that we're listening by some high-level initiatives, and then let's roll it out more incrementally. Think of engagement as more of at least a 3-year initiative.
Yeah.
So your first year, this baseline, a few high-level action planning items. The second year, you could roll that down to even 1 or 2 more levels in the organization. You may not go all the way, to the frontline manager, even in the second administration.
So I want you to explain the fourth box in more detail, and while you're doing that, I want to launch a poll at the same time to ask the audience, which of these 4 areas do you think your organization best represents or falls into? So I'll run the poll now. Go ahead and finish up the 4th area, and then we'll talk some more.
Yeah, so at this point, we're really into that full transformational approach to engagement. You're receiving the results every year. You're action planning at the manager level, but really what's happening with this data, this information, is that you are making some large organizational changes and initiatives, trainings, leadership development, organizational changes that really help to create and drive that culture of engagement within your organization. And so really you're thick into developing that leadership capacity within the organization. At this point, you're often holding leaders accountable, for their results. Your results for engagement may be tied to other results as well as part of a scorecard. We have organizations that have had a lot of success at this phase. But again, that doesn't happen all at once. That really happens over time.
And so I closed the poll. I'm going to share the results with you now. And it looks like, Kristen, most of the people are in this established baseline phase or executive action planning phase, where they're using the results at a high level. About 24% are doing action planning, and then 15% are providing or using it to drive kind of the training, leadership development, organization development initiatives in their company.
Let me just briefly describe one of the clients that we've worked with for over 10 years, really. And they started with this very first year we worked with them, this establishing a baseline. So they ran an employee engagement survey, and they did that for a couple of years, and I think it was the second year where they started implementing even other types of feedback mechanisms, so 360 feedback. And then, eventually over a period of time, probably within 3 to 4 years, they had managers involved in the action planning process. Now, 10 years later, they have a scorecard for each of their leaders that includes service effectiveness, so how are they doing internally as a team,
yeah.
As an HR team or as a sales team. They have engagement scores, they have 360 feedback, and even their performance numbers. And so that all comes as part of this creating a culture of feedback. And what was really cool, so the business case for this is that they are a staffing company, and they started with a high percentage of turnover, higher than the industry. And there's a really cool graph that their head of VP of HR showed us that tracked their attrition, their turnover over time, that actually decreased over that 10 years. At the same time, their revenue numbers actually increased.
Yeah, because the only way they could grow is really to keep their people.
Exactly.
And keep adding to them.
And they had the foresight to see that or to know that. And so again, it was incremental change that has put them in Fortune's top 100 places to work now over time. So it's a pretty cool thing if you can kind of have that line of sight to your long-term strategy.
So we'll provide this roadmap, and Kristen kind of touched on this in terms of, okay, if you're doing this for the first time, what's a good strategy to use to implement? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to do this. Some people we've seen are able to take in year 1 and year 2 tasks within the first year, but this gives you a good idea of maybe what to plan on as you want to roll this out.
Yeah, so again, we're talking things like baseline. It's building that trust. So confidentiality becomes very important in your first administration. Employees, depending on your current culture, they may fear that if they respond, that their responses will be, tied back to them.
Yeah.
And so, your first administration, you're building a lot of trust that yes, we are going to keep this confidential. There won't be retribution or negative consequences. So again, having that executive planning, kind of 1 or 2 priorities, doing something with the results, sharing the high-level results overall. And in fact, our best practice would be that as you plan your high-level initiatives, you even staff those committees with a cross-functional team, people at the front line of the organization, all the way up at different job levels. And what that does is that creates a lot of excitement and momentum. People think, wow, they really did take seriously. And even if you don't address all of the items, which you won't be able to your first year, I mean, you may see some low scores where you're like, wow, this is going to take some time. But, that's where people like DecisionWise, our consultants work with you to say, here are the key things that would make the most difference. Here are some quick wins, as well as here are some initiatives that will make, really help people start feeling like they're being heard.
Good points.
So second year, it's really important to look at trend information. You want to see progress that's been made, especially on those areas where you focused. Really starting to dig into the demographic information. And our recommendation is to not ask those demographic questions on a survey, but that information can be embedded in the unique link that gets sent to each individual who participates in the survey. And therefore, we're able to get more valid and correct data. Sharing those results down to managers, it may not be all the way down, but it could be maybe the first or second level of managers.
That's where it's really important getting the logistics right, because if you are collecting data and having people answer those demographic questions, you're going to get bad breakouts for your managers. They're not going to add up, right? So they're not going to get the same number. Like I thought I had 20 people in my department. It looks like I have 30 according to this report. Where are these extra people coming from?
That's really important. So self-reporting of demographics such as, okay, Charles, which group supervisor do you report to? Which department are you in? We don't recommend, if there's any possible way, to not ask those on the survey, but to provide that information to us through your HRIS, and then we can be confident that we have the correct information. Yeah. So the validity of the data, you're right, is important. And then at this point, you want to start looking at business metrics. So what is the return on your investment in this? What are some things, can we start looking at attrition? Can we look at customer SAT scores? There are other types of metrics. Safety is something that's common with some of our clients that work in a manufacturing environment. Yeah. That can be really helpful to start looking at how does engagement impact each of these.
Well, and most people we find are doing an engagement survey to address attrition, to keep, to boost retention.
Yeah, a lot of time that is a big concern.
You can tie it pretty closely with your engagement scores.
Yep, and particularly in today's environment where the numbers show that by, is it 2018 or 2019, that there will be more jobs available than people to fulfill them. There really is the need to keep and retain the talent that you have. The final year, or not the final year, but the next year and ongoing is where you start hopefully having more of these organizational-wide initiatives based on and what we're meaning, there's things beyond just providing good top-down communication or providing some recognition. It's really developing leaders in a strong way, creating that kind of accountability mechanism we talked about, where you're holding leaders accountable for those results, as well as other organizational development and training initiatives.
So next best practice is really helping your employees and managers understand the definition of employee engagement that you're using. So you run the survey, you probably talk a lot about employee engagement in your organization. As HR professionals, you're probably very familiar with the term and what it means. But one thing you need to do is really make sure you communicate that and articulate it to your employees. So ours is this: it's employee engagement is an emotional state where you feel passionate, energetic, and committed to your work. And then when you're in that state, when you feel engaged, then you'll do your best work. You'll actually put forth that discretionary effort. Contribute your best self. So it's a two-part definition, really. It's that finding yourself in that state or that emotional feeling of engagement, and that contributing to how you perform at work. And then we look at engagement. One thing we see quite often in different definitions and models around engagement is that a lot of times satisfaction is mixed in with engagement. Now, satisfaction is important. It's really the foundation here, and it's really what you need to have in place before engagement can thrive.
Yeah, and satisfaction are things that are part of your basic job contract with your employee. It's, if you do this work, this is what I'll pay. It's, when I come to work, I expect to be in a safe environment. I expect to have the tools and resources I need to do my job. But those things really don't cause engagement. Those are really, as you mentioned, these satisfaction components. Now, if they are lacking, so let's say, and I worked with a client recently where their questions, they did add some questions around compensation, and the scores were low. So, if there's those things lacking where you're not competitive in the market according to employees' perceptions, then you need to address that, because that can actually cause disengagement or prevent you from being engaged. You have to have that foundation in place. But those factors are not necessarily going to create engagement.
A lot of companies invest in perks, for example, which we would say fall under the satisfaction umbrella. So you can add a lot of different perks, and actually satisfaction is one of the great drivers for attracting new talent, because they come to your organization, they see all these cool benefits and things that you offer, and it also helps retain people. So if you're paying people well, they're less likely to leave, but that doesn't necessarily engage them in their work.
And that's a really good point. We are located here in the Salt Lake area, which is what they term the Silicon Slopes. So we have a lot of tech companies that are up and coming and have really made a landmark here as far as talent goes. But, when working with these tech companies, that is a very important component, those satisfaction components are the perks, because you as an employee are looking at, what does this company offer versus this company. You're not going to understand what the environment in the company fully is like yet. What we find is those are good attraction components. But you also have to keep in mind the adaptation principle, which is as soon as you offer something, then people adapt to it, and that becomes the new norm. And so you'll never keep pace, and you'll never keep people engaged by just offering these satisfaction components. But once they're in your organization, it's the engagement, it's the heart, spirit, hands, and minds. It's that discretionary effort. It's creating the kind of culture where you have these other drivers we'll talk about in a second that really keep people in the long term.
Yeah, and so what really drives engagement are these magic components. So meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, and connection.
Meaning is, do I find that there's a purpose in what I do every day? Do I feel like I connect to something larger than myself? That meaning, even in your daily work, is something that needs to be part of, or people want to feel like it's part of their job. Autonomy is that freedom to feel like you can, or that you're empowered to make a difference, to do what you do, on a daily basis to the best that you can, and having a little bit of that freedom. Now, different industries that might vary. So, for example, when I work with clients who are in the financial, industry, or on a manufacturing floor where there's a lot of regulations or requirements, policies, protocol, you have a little bit less of that, in the day-to-day, but there still are ways that you can create, give people that sense of empowerment, solving problems, other things. Growth is something that we find is often a challenging thing for organizations to do really well at. And so a lot of what our conversation is around growth is that relationship between the manager and the employee is more of a 50-50 proposition. And that's what we'd say with all these magic components. But it's really, helping to provide the environment, but also putting people a choice for their own growth and their own development. but supporting what they're interested in and providing possibilities within the organization. Impact is, okay, I can see what I'm doing today is going to impact the company in a positive way or impact my team in a positive way. And then finally, connection. I mean, I know you don't like connection too much because you like to close your door and just be in your office all the time.
Need my space.
No, actually, I think we all need connection. And again, all of these components of engagement or elements of engagement may be different for each person. What's important to you might be the growth and connection, even more so than maybe me. For me, it might be that I feel like there's meaning in what I do. But all of those elements are part of engagement to some level for each individual employee in the organization.
All of this information that we've talked about is contained in our book, Magic, the 5 Keys to Unlock the Power of Employee Engagement. Based on all of our research over the past 20 years, all the survey responses we've collected, and the psychological research that's been done on motivation, engagement, and retention, what makes people really want to work. So if you'd like to receive a copy, again, it's available on Amazon or any other bookstore. I'll send out a link to that as well after our presentation today. So measuring engagement, we use a set of anchor questions to measure the overall level of engagement. So the recommendation we have is don't just use one question and don't just add up all the questions on your survey to get it. You really need to figure out which questions you're going to use to measure the overall level of engagement.
Yeah, so what to support what you're saying, what we've often seen when people come to us is they may be using one question on the survey. So something like, overall, I'm fully engaged in doing my best work. Well, there's a couple of problems with that question. Number one, there's self-serving bias inherent in that question. Whenever you answer a question based on I do this or I'm good at this or this is how I act with my work, then you're going to have an inflated perception, an inflated score.
Yeah.
Because we all think
I'm engaged. It's these other people around here.
Exactly, exactly. So we ask questions that in aggregate come together and help us look at someone's level of engagement. So for example, question 1, it's easy to become absorbed in my job. It's really almost putting the focus on the job. The job is what absorbs me versus I'm someone who's naturally absorbed in the work I do.
Naturally absorbent.
Yeah, naturally absorbent. There you go. So these aggregates come together and create what we call our engagement index. One other thing to mention is when we come up with this index, we don't just take the favorable score of all these questions and then come up with a favorable index score. What we actually do is look at the average score of each individual person, and based on their response of either disagree to a strongly agree on a 5-point scale, we'll bucket them into one of these 4 categories. So fully engaged employees, key contributors, opportunity, or fully disengaged. There's a lot that's in the news about 70% of employees in the workplace are disengaged.
Right.
And that's just not what our research shows us. We find that most people in organizations are engaged at some level of engagement. And so this highest level of engagement is typically around 28 to 32% for most organizations. But this other next group, key contributors, they're just as critical. They're an important, stable part of the organization. And so if you want to think about combining those two, that's really what we're talking about, the number of engaged employees in your organization.
And then we have some descriptors here. So what does it mean to be fully engaged versus fully disengaged? And we're not going to go through all of them, but you can see there's kind of a continuum. And again, when you're feeling that you're in that state of full engagement, that's when you really want to contribute the most. You have a lot of personal satisfaction, the quality of your work, you really love your job. And it's really that opportunity group that you want to focus on, because there's so few that are fully disengaged. That opportunity group is where you can make the most difference in your organization.
And we don't provide everybody the names of who's in each category because that would breach confidentiality. But as you look at these behaviors, you start to get a sense of, oh yeah, I know someone who kind of is like that, right? And so for what you said, focusing on the opportunity group, they're the ones that we can move more easily into the key contributor or fully engaged area. It could be a wrong job fit. It could be that that there's a relationship with the manager. And one of the things that we do in our analysis is look at each of these different groups and understand what is it that is a positive or negative in their view. We look at the other questions that they answered. So you can start to get a profile of what an opportunity group person looks like, or a key contributor employee. Those fully disengaged, again, your best option there is to try to manage them out of the organization.
So if we look at, I want to change gears and talk about how to survey, or what are the best practices in using questions and actually surveying employee engagement. So I'm showing a sample survey here of our employee engagement survey. It includes about 50 questions. You can see that we've got the items categorized in different groupings. So there's my job, my team, my supervisor, my organization, and then a couple open-ended questions at the end. And Kristen, I was going to have you kind of describe some of the best practices in terms of measuring overall engagement, types of questions to use, and scales and things like that.
Sure. So one of the things that's, I guess, kind of a key philosophy that we have at DecisionWise is that that surveys should be enjoyable to take. So we really want to focus on a survey that takes no longer than 10 to 15 minutes at the very most. Our standard survey is designed to be about 8 to 10 minutes long. And you'll see that we stay with a consistent scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree. We have a don't know, not applicable option for people who feel like they can't respond. But really, your scores there should be really low. Most of the survey questions should be relevant, and people should be able to feel like they can answer them, or it's probably not a question you should be asking to your whole group. Yeah. But we have recommend about 50 items with 2 open-ended comments. And that's usually a good survey size that will take that 8 to 10 minutes. Another thing that really helps is what we call frames of reference. So you'll see this frame of reference here, questions related to my supervisor. Above that are questions related to my job. And then those can be customized. So it could be maybe my team or my department, depending on your organizational structure. And then questions related to my organization or my company. And so what you're doing is you're allowing the individual who's participating or taking the survey to really have that perspective of these are questions that are related to this frame of reference, and they're able to take those survey questions or respond rather quickly through that. What we also do, Charles, as you can see here, is that we embed some of the engagement anchor questions as well as the magic questions throughout the whole survey.
So there's been a lot of, there's a lot of new kind of technology on the market in terms of providing always-on type surveys, shorter surveys, pulse surveys, surveying throughout the year. We're showing kind of an annual survey that includes a lot of different questions that gives you a really good set of information to work with. What do you recommend in terms of doing pulse surveys as well, or complementing the process with those?
Yeah, pulse surveys can be great. I know there's a lot of buzz around always-on and pulse surveys. Our recommendation, based on trying a lot of these different things out over the years, is that an annual survey is really where you're going to get the bulk of your information and where you really focus your efforts on action planning. And so having that for the first 3 or 4 years, having that on an annual basis, and then as you've created that culture of feedback where you're starting to get into the larger organizational initiatives, then sometimes moving to an 18-month or 2-year time frame, and in between that doing a pulse. That pulse can be focused on some specific initiatives you have. So don't eliminate that annual survey. Now, to check in on how you're doing on some of your actions, it's a great idea. So let's say your first administration, you decide to do a pulse at 6 months. Make sure you've had enough time to actually implement a couple of the high-level initiatives that you have developed as an executive team. But let's say one's related to a recognition program, or doing a better job at recognizing employees, and you've implemented some good strategies around there throughout the organization. Doing a pulse at the 6-month mark or the 9-month mark to ask specifically about how that recognition program is going is a great way to gather some data in between the surveys.
But I think what you're doing every time you're conducting a survey, you're committing to take action, right?
You are.
Especially your managers if you're going to be doing pulse surveys. And so you have to balance the the workload or the effort it takes to really act on the survey results, or else the fourth time you do a pulse survey over 6 months, employees will start saying, well, nothing is happening. We keep responding to these things, and there's not a lot of change. So if you're committed to it, your managers are, and you're going to use the data, pulse surveying is great. The other thing you have to be careful of is pulse surveying works really well in an organization where employees are sitting at desks with computers and are connected to the internet. If you have an organization that's like a manufacturing organization or maybe distributed services where not all of your employees are sitting at a desk all the time, they're kind of performing different things, then it's really difficult to round them up and get them to take a pulse survey all the time. And so what ends up happening is you get the vocal people on both ends of the spectrum, those that are really happy and those that are really unhappy. And then your data isn't so robust afterwards.
Well, what's interesting, I think that in our minds we think, oh, pulse, short, right, easy. But in fact, I think you hit it on the head. To conduct a pulse survey, you have to plan to take action on it. You need to make sure you're, asking the right people. And so, sometimes it is not as much, but a lot of effort to do. So something to keep in mind for sure.
Well, and can you talk about also best practices when it comes to using how to administer the survey? So paper surveys versus online surveys versus a kiosk or mobile devices, things like that.
The first recommendation is that you always survey everyone in your organization. So if you have a group that is in a remote location or doesn't have access to email, it's important that they're included in that annual survey experience. And so there's a couple of different options that we can use. Email, of course, is the easiest, but there's also a kiosk option. Kiosk is actually really nice because if an employee doesn't have their own email address, but they do have access to a computer or a tablet or they just really need an internet connection, then we can send them a paper that says, here's your kiosk code, here's the URL, and you just go there and you can take the survey still online.
I think one of the difficulties is if you're just handing out codes or even handing out paper surveys, you're going to get a low response rate if you don't try to group people together or bring them together at some point in time to take it. Because otherwise they'll say, okay, great, I'm going to go back to my shift now and do my work. I don't have time to do this.
Well, and it's important to do it on company time. So encourage it. This isn't something we're asking you to do on your personal time. If there's any way to do it on company time, that's really quite important. We work with a few nonprofits where it's a little challenging, where you're out in the Africa. And in fact, we are working with one right now where our participation rates, we're all holding our breath because they're not as high as they should be, but we're talking Ethiopia, right? So there's some challenges with the, just getting people to where they have internet access. But I think you bring up a good point, and for kiosk and paper administration, that's really some of the logistical things that you want to consider. If you can bring people in all in one, like on a manufacturing plant, it's very common that we'll bring people in on their shifts or in groups, and then we'll just distribute a paper survey, and then they take it all at the same time during a 15 or 30-minute block.
So what's a good participation rate to shoot for?
A good participation rate for a first-time administration is around 75%.
Okay.
And that's what we typically find. Now we do, at DecisionWise, provide a managed service, so we have project managers and consultants who are tracking those participation, identifying where scores are a little bit low, and helping to send additional communication to certain functions or locations. But 75% is what we typically see for a first-time administration.
And then how do you ensure confidentiality, or at least instill confidence in employees that everything is going to be confidential?
That's a really important topic that we address a lot in that first administration, because there's a lot riding on it for not only you as HR, who is kind of backing this process, but also for employees to feel like they can have a confidential voice and really express what they think. So we do a couple of things. Number one, in communication that goes out from internally, we recommend that the CEO first start by sending out a letter promising confidentiality, saying that we're partnering with a third-party vendor. Then we say follow that up with an HR email that gives more of the logistical details, as well as further supports confidentiality, and then also reaching out to managers who will be getting access to any of the data, any leaders, and letting them know that they will be expected to receive results. And so please encourage participation within your teams and reiterate the importance of this and the confidential nature of it. The second thing we do is just in our emails that we send out with links to the survey, we reiterate that groups, that responses will not be grouped in groups smaller than 5, and that's our threshold.
So as we've been talking, I've shown on the screen our online reporting tool, our leadership intelligence system, and this is where we take the data, the employee survey data, and actually show it online and allow clients to interact with the data. I want to talk now about best practices in reporting. So what should organizations be looking for as they're rolling out the results either to HR, the executive team, managers in the organization?
Well, what you're showing here is really what we would say is our analyst view. And the reason why we call it our analyst view is because you'll notice on the right-hand side you have a whole lot of different filters. So as you're looking at the results, you can start comparing how different locations responded, how different tenure groups, and what's powerful about it is you begin to form a narrative, a story. It's less just about, okay, overall we got a low score on top-down communication, but you can drill in and understand where specifically is it that things might be working around top-down communication or where things might not be working. In fact, some organizations you see a whole lot of difference based on locations, things that stand out as being more of a challenge or more of a strength in that location.
Yeah, so I'll show an example of how you're trying to get insight from the results. Here we're looking at scores to all the questions, and we're seeing that the lowest scoring questions now, I've sorted it so the favorable questions are lowest to highest. And the one that's kind of, not perplexing, but of concern is noticing that the level of stress is high, communication is low, the amount of work seems to be high. And so if you look at this and say, okay, where are people feeling overworked and stressed, you can look at an individual question and then break it out by these different segments. And so here we see St. Louis and Los Angeles are scoring the lowest in that particular area. You can say, okay, now is this just my manager, is it all employees or just my managers? Who's feeling it worse? And so here you can see New York managers actually have the most unfavorable responses when it comes to being overworked or feeling if their work is reasonable. So those are some of the insights that you're trying to understand when you're looking at some of these responses, because again, if you see a low scoring question, you're wondering, okay, is that everyone in the organization or is that a subset of the population of some sort, and where is this really most acute and where should we focus our resources?
So this kind of insight to these demographic cuts, and you'll also see that we set up a structure, so maybe you can go to just show how that works, where you can see all of the different groups, departments, sub-departments, divisions, whatever it might be in your organization, and you can compare those as well as look at those as well. This really is for the eyes of you as HR, because you're coming up with high-level strategies. How are we going to help these groups? How am I going to best support them as the accountability partner, right? You're there to help them to be successful, but not necessarily solve all the problems for them. I mean, that's part of the ownership given to those leaders. But I would say we find it most successful if HR leaders and business partners, executives who may want this kind of insight, but sometimes they don't even want this level of detail, have access to this information. Perhaps if you have VPs or division leaders with lots of different geographic locations, this kind of an analyst view is nice because you're seeing, for example, here, based on your org structure, you can set up a comparison that shows the next level down and how those groups compare to each other. So that can be really helpful for that level of leadership. When we're talking about someone who is at a manager level, we'll show you that in a minute. We don't recommend having all of these filters and all this information. Number one, it goes back to the confidentiality concern that you brought up earlier. We don't want to get too granular, but more importantly, it's really important for those groups to focus on their immediate team And so, we want to show how they compare to the norm, perhaps, but we don't necessarily want to show all these kinds of breakouts and how they compare to other teams like them.
And one thing we see a best practice among organizations is looking at the different department scores. And so then you can see, okay, where do we need to focus some effort? Well, these 20 departments down here have the lowest scores. Obviously, there's some issues there. Is it management? Is it that they're understaffed? What's really going on in these areas that we can take some pay attention to?
And that's a really good point, Charles, because it may feel, especially those of you in large organizations, you may be saying to yourself, I can't even imagine rolling it out to all these different leaders because then I'm going to be responsible for helping them. But often we say if we give enough good information and clarification on when we roll out the results and what the expectations are, then a lot of times they can create their action plans on their own and kind of be self-directed. You can then focus your efforts on the lower performers, the maybe the top 10, or excuse me, the bottom 10% or the bottom 20% of your organization.
Yeah, that's where you have the most impact. I'm showing now, we talked about the engagement index and how we measured engagement using anchor questions. One analysis that is helpful is breaking that out and seeing the common perceptions between the different groups. So right now I'm looking at this opportunity group, which is the 13% of the people in the organization, and I'm seeing that some of their positive perceptions are that they feel challenged and stretched, their supervisor is fair, they trust their supervisor. But the things that are providing or maybe compromising their engagement are things about having autonomy, freedom to choose how they do their job, or having a motivating environment to work in, communication throughout the organization. Some of those things are scoring low among the people in this group.
Yes, and so like I mentioned before, this is where you start to get a profile of what does a opportunity group person look like in your organization. And what's nice about it is it goes beyond just here are the 5 highest or 5 lowest scores for my team or for the company. You can start identifying where is it that I need to focus my efforts. It could be that these negative perceptions are the lowest scoring questions for that group, but it could be that they're not. And so when you really understand, what it is that creates positive or negative views of the organization, you have I think, a more clear way in which to proceed in action planning.
The same thing with attrition. So again, most organizations are measuring engagement and trying to improve engagement to improve attrition. And one best practice in terms of how you analyze and really focus on attrition is to use an attrition question like we're using here. If given a choice, I'd remain with this organization. And you can see we've broken it out the same way that we've done with the engagement index into 4 different groups. And we're looking at, again, this undecided group, 18%. So we have people that are fully committed, some that are content here. And then if we looked at undecided, what are some of the things that are making them question whether they want to stay with the organization or not? Well, the level of stress, again, motivating and energizing workplace, some of these same things that are affecting engagement are also impacting their overall level of commitment to stay.
And again, I think what these different views give you is a more robust way to approach your action planning.
Yeah. So, Kristen, what are some best practices around using comments? Because it can be overwhelming to get a whole, pages, 20, 30, 100 pages of comments written by employees and trying to figure out what's the best way to use those. Typically, we say your comments give you some good insight into the reasons behind the score. So if you're seeing that stress is high, workload is high, look to your comments because that's where we're going to find the answers or some of the easiest answers about the reasons behind those scores.
I agree. Comments have some of the best, richest data in there. In fact, I'm always thrilled when we have, a client who says, hey, we need those comments first thing because our CEO is going on vacation and wants to read them while he's on, while he or she is on vacation. So what it shows you is they really care about the value of those comments. But it is a lot to deal with, and so there's a couple of things. What we're showing here is really just a filtering tool where you can, again, look at comments by different functions in your structure, by manager scores versus non. All of the confidentiality measures, again, are built into this. So, if we get responses lower than 5, then we don't show them because we wouldn't want to compromise, any individual people, their responses. But this is really helpful for you as HR. Let's say that there's some initiatives that you've, put into place recently, and you can type that word in and actually see what the key themes are. For both of the questions, we recommend what are the strengths of this company versus, and also what things might need to be improved. Two open-ended questions typically cover it based on our experience. But what's also really beneficial is we very frequently, use a text analytics tool to create a comment theme summary. And so we're looking at what are the key themes that come out and categorizing those, and then coming back to you from the high-level perspective. Here are the key themes that come out of your comments.
Yeah, so if you're in HR, you at least want to make sure you've read through the comments, especially if you're presenting these results to the executive team. If you've read all the comments, you will have an excellent idea about what's going on in the organization. And you'll know the data inside and out and backwards and forwards. It really gives you some great insight. And then if you can summarize those and theme those based on some of the things that you've seen and tie them back to the overall results like stress and workload, for example, you'll have a really good, strong case to go to your executive team and say, hey, it's time to hire. I know, we've been holding off to make our numbers look good, but we're going to start losing people here pretty soon if we don't do anything.
It looks like a question just came in asking about how about providing comments for leaders or managers.
Yeah, managers.
Yeah, it's always the question. So, often our clients for the first administration, because we're keeping it high level, won't share any of those comments directly with leaders. In fact, we don't ever recommend repeating verbatim, or even, even if it's a positive comment, something someone says really nicely about the organization, if you ever display that in front of all your employees thinking, oh, we're showing this is good, that employee who wrote that comment is suddenly going to feel vulnerable.
Right.
So we don't ever recommend sharing individual comments, but themes are very appropriate.
Yeah.
And so that comment categorization you mentioned can be extremely helpful. Once you have created a culture of feedback in your organization, you've administered the survey, even in the second year, some organizations have that level of trust where we can, share comments with leaders. And that's really where you want to get to, because the leaders are the ones that can look at the comments for their team and, take some initiative or take some action based on that, or create more clarification or have better understanding on some initiatives and quick wins around those comments. So that's really where you want to get to, but it may not be the first or second year till, administration, until you get past that, till you can share those with everyone.
So I want to transition as we kind of near the end of our presentation to talk about best practices in action planning on the results. And we'll kind of put this in a case study format where we're looking at an overall goal. So like Kristen was mentioning before, you want to make sure you come up with some initiatives for the organization overall in terms of saying, okay, as an organization, we heard you, here's what we're planning on doing to make the situation better or to improve the organization. One case study here is with the healthcare organization that we worked with, where they got a low score on this question about this organization cares about its employees. And so they decided to create a goal around caring. Well, that's kind of a difficult concept to really communicate and say, hey, what are we going to do about caring? People just need to be nicer and give hugs or something. What are we going to do?
Which might not go over very well, actually.
Right.
Especially for HR, right?
So what they decided, though, is there are a couple specific things after gathering some more information and feedback from employees. Number one, employees felt like the senior leaders just weren't visible, and this was contributing to this low caring score. And so the goal was that they'd make themselves more visible. Well, how are they going to go do that? Well, they came up with an initiative called Rounding, where leaders would get out and about and actually spend time every day meeting with their employees and seeing what's going on and trying to be more supportive. They also established 1 hour of open office time each day where they were available for employees to come in and talk to them because, again, the perception was that they were never there or they were always in meetings and never could be, no one could ever talk to them about anything. And then they added a question on the survey that said the leaders of my department are visible on a regular basis to conduct the next time. So this ensured that as they're rolling out this initiative, leaders would be held accountable because now you're going to get a score to see how well you're doing on this particular initiative. So I kind of put teeth behind the overall goal within the organization.
Yeah, I love this example because, you know, what it is, it's supported from the organization all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just saying, okay, leaders, you've got to go find 1 hour of open office time. It's saying, no, this is something that we support, and we're going to hold you accountable if you're not providing this to your employees.
And so the benefit is that their score went up 4% the next year on that particular question about this organization cares about employees. And so you can see the direct impact that some of these initiatives can have, and not only does that improve caring, but that, you know, contributes to retention and a variety of other factors in terms of making it a better place to work. So, so you can see kind of how this organization goal is rolled out. Another example is then, okay, well, how does a manager go about and kind of implement something like this? Well, there's lots of tools out there. One tool I'm showing you here is our tool called Depot, which is our online action planning tool for managers, where you can, you know, populate your goals throughout the organization based around some of these initiatives. And so this manager's created a goal about recognition, interacting with staff, improving top-down communication, and then hiring 2 more nurses to fulfill an open position that, you know, of course, to address the staffing issue that there always is. And so this manager can kind of see the progress of these different tasks, how old it is, when it's due, how many days behind they might be on particular goals. They can go in and create new goals or edit these 2 goals. It just depends on what they want to do. And then there's different tasks that you can add as well to kind of define this better. So it's really flexible, and it provides a nice framework and reminder system for managers to create goals. On top of that, it creates some visibility. So now I can see the goals that other people within the organization have as well, and you can see kind of where people are in terms of creating these goals and progressing on their goals. And lastly, as an HR leader, you want to be able to hold people accountable to see where they are on these particular goals in each of these different departments and see that roll-up effect and see where you can support people. And so having an online tool helps you kind of manage all that and really maintain the momentum when it comes to action planning and goal setting.
You know, and one just other important best practice here when it comes to this, especially, again, you as HR, your responsibility is to help support the accountability process, but not create the goal for the team. And in fact, a manager or a leader of a team should also not do that in a vacuum. Really, it should be a group collaborative approach to say, okay, here's what our scores say. What do we want to focus on? What do we care about changing? And then this tool that you showed, Charles, was really designed around that, you know, that visibility across the team, so that you can support that action planning, not just put that on only the shoulders of the leader.
So I'll transition again to a couple other areas or slides that I wanted to talk about. One being the ability to analyze your results. There's lots of different things that you can do with this, and one of the things we hear from organizations all the time is, how do we justify employee engagement? You know, how do we make it so that executive leadership cares, managers care about it, and that it has an impact on our performance in the organization? Well, there's a variety of different ways. We've talked about attrition already. That's one of the biggest things, because there's a direct correlation to costs when you lose someone. You know, it costs between $50,000 to $100,000 per person for some organizations to replace that person and get them up to speed again. So that's one obvious one you can look at. Other organizations might look at workers' compensation claims, union vulnerability, customer satisfaction is a big one, especially in retail and service organizations, or patient satisfaction. Healthcare is really concerned about patient satisfaction now, especially as there's patient satisfaction scores are tied to some of the reimbursement funding that they receive from the federal government. And the manager influence on engagement as well is really impactful. So you can kind of compare that to the engagement levels of your manager. So I'm just kind of showing you a variety of different things you can do with your data to really understand the impact that it's having on your organization and where it goes. The last piece I'll end with here is this manager influence. And so we reiterate that if you want to spend the most or the most bang for your buck in terms of energy to spend on your employee engagement survey process is with your leaders, your managers, because they'll have the most influence over your employees. And this graph here shows you that as we look at the overall level of engagement by manager group. And so this is a huge study that we did with close to 20,000 employees and 2,300 managers. And what we did, we looked at 22 different companies, and we looked at the engagement levels of their managers. So of all the managers, 808 were fully engaged, 1,154 were key contributors, and so on. Within the fully engaged group, within these managers, those that reported to them, their direct reports, they reported that there were 36% fully engaged, 48% in the key contributor group, and so on. So you can see, looking at the green bars here, that there are more fully engaged employees under these more fully engaged managers, and as you go down the line, it gets less and less. Luckily, a fully disengaged manager doesn't automatically kill engagement for employees. You know, some are still fully engaged within those groups. But if you can focus on the engagement levels of your managers, it has a big impact on the teams that they manage within your organization.
And you know, that was a really delightful finding for us, because we thought, okay, if you're a disengaged manager, you're going to have disengaged employees. Mm-hmm. But what we see is that there are, you know, definitely is an impact. There's fewer fully engaged and more disengaged, but in all reality, you still have, you know, people who can maintain their levels of engagement even with a difficult disengaged manager.
Yeah, and one of the other key findings we found in some of our other research is that if there's two things you're going to do after the employee engagement survey, number one is focus on action planning with your managers. Those organizations that were doing action planning with their managers were seeing that their engagement scores were increasing year over year as opposed to staying stagnant or going down. And the other thing was to provide training to your managers, both leadership training and training on employee engagement. What does it mean to engage your employees? Those organizations that were doing that, we're seeing increases in their engagement scores year over year as well.
And you know, what's interesting about our approach, based on our research, Charles, is that we found that providing that engagement training even to frontline individual contributors,
yeah.
You know, all the way down in the organization is important, because you're giving people a tool to say, here's how I own my own engagement.
Yeah.
It's not just the responsibility of the organization. Sure, the organization has, you know, needs to create the kind of environment and provide the right, you know, factors or pieces that can help the person be engaged. But it's still the choice of the employee. And so educating all of your employees and your leaders about their role in engagement helps to kind of take that heavy burden that sometimes I think organizations feel like it's up to me. Well, it's a 50-50 proposition like we talked about. You have both sides that have to be a choice in creating an engaged workplace.
So as we near the end of our presentation, I'm showing you the HRCI and SHRM activity codes for the presentation. I'll also send an email, so if you don't get a chance to write them down right now, look for my email later today. The handouts are in the handout section. I will be sending an email with a link to those as well. And again, if you are looking, obviously DecisionWise conducts employee engagement surveys for clients around the world. If you're looking for a partner, or if you'd like a comparative quote just to see how maybe your current process compares in cost to what DecisionWise can offer, please let me know. We'll send that to you so you can get a good idea for budgeting purposes. Thanks, everyone. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say, I would also offer, I'm happy to talk with any of you at some point, you know, whatever level you're at with your own engagement strategy in the organization. I work a lot in kind of road mapping out what that might look like for organizations and helping to create that change. So I'd be happy to talk to anyone as well if you have questions or want to kind of brainstorm some ideas.
Excellent. Thanks, Kristen. And thanks, everyone, for joining us. We look forward to having you join us on a future webinar.